A man saved the life of a polar bear, and days later, he appeared and brought with him. The snowstorm had rolled in faster than the town of Coldhaven expected. Its icy fingers clawed at the wooden frames of cabins and muffled every sound under a suffocating blanket of white. For days, the town's few residents huddled indoors, waiting for the fury of nature to pass. On the fifth day, the storm broke, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. It was then that Caleb Grayson appeared. No one had seen him come in. His old, battered truck sat in the middle of the main street, as if it had been dropped there by the storm itself. He didn't seem to belong, not in this tight-knit Alaskan community where everyone knew everyone's business. Caleb was tall, with a rough beard and eyes that seemed older than his 30-something years. He rented a room above the general store, spoke to no one unless necessary, and spent hours staring out over the frozen tundra. "He's running from something," whispered Ellen, the store clerk, as Caleb stocked up on supplies. Or someone. No one dared to ask Caleb about his past. But they noticed the scars on his hands, the slight limp in his walk, and the way his eyes darted as if he was always waiting for trouble to find him. It wasn't until Caleb's third week in town that the polar bear appeared. Jake Henderson, the town's unofficial tracker and lifelong outdoorsman, was the first to spot it. He saw the massive creature limping along the edge of the forest, a deep gash visible on its snow-white flank. The sight was unusual but not unheard of. Polar bears were rare this far inland, but hunger could drive them to desperate measures. "Stay clear," Jake warned the townsfolk. "A wounded bear is a dangerous bear." But Caleb didn't listen. That night, under the flickering light of the town's only street lamp, Caleb stood in the middle of the road, staring out at the forest. The snow crunched under his boots as he walked toward the dark line of trees. A few minutes later, he disappeared into the shadows. When morning came, Caleb was back, but he wasn't alone. Dragging a sled behind him, he approached the town square, where a small crowd had gathered. On the sled lay the polar bear, unconscious but breathing. Caleb's coat was torn, his hands bloodied, and his face pale from exhaustion. "What in God's name?" Jake muttered, stepping forward. Caleb ignored him. "It's wounded," he said hoarsely. "It won't survive out there. Someone needs to help it." The townsfolk stared in disbelief. Saving a polar bear? It was madness. Dangerous. Illegal, even. But Caleb's eyes burned with a quiet determination that silenced every protest. Against their better judgment, they helped him. As the bear was taken to an old barn on the edge of town, Caleb worked tirelessly to clean its wounds and keep it alive. Ellen brought supplies, and Jake lent his expertise. But the bear's survival wasn't the only thing people were talking about. Rumors spread like wildfire. "Why would he risk his life for a bear?" one man asked. "Maybe he's trying to make up for something," another replied. The real answer came a week later, in the form of a visitor. A black SUV rolled into town, its windows tinted and its license plates unfamiliar. Out stepped a man in a sharp suit, his expression cold as the winter air. He walked into the general store and placed a photo on the counter. "Have you seen this man?" he asked Ellen. The photo was of Caleb. Ellen hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her apron. She glanced down at the photo of Caleb, her mind racing. The man in the suit, with his sharp features and piercing gray eyes, exuded authority, and something darker, something that set her instincts on edge. "Why are you looking for him?" Ellen asked cautiously, trying to buy time. The man's smile was thin and devoid of warmth. "That's not your concern, ma'am. All you need to do is answer the question. Have you seen him?" Ellen's heart pounded. She thought of Caleb, his quiet demeanor, the way he'd thrown himself into saving the polar bear without hesitation. He wasn't just a drifter, she realized. There was something about him, a weight he carried, that hinted at a story far deeper than anyone in Coldhaven could have guessed. She forced a polite smile. "Can't say I have. People come and go through here all the time." The man's eyes narrowed, scanning her face for any sign of deception. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "If you do see him, it would be nice to let me know. Here's my card." He slid a sleek black card across the counter. No name, just a phone number embossed in silver. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Ellen frozen in place. Caleb was in the barn when Ellen found him. The polar bear, still weak but recovering, lay on a bed of hay. Caleb was kneeling beside it, his hands gentle as he cleaned the wound on its flank. "You have to go," Ellen blurted out, her voice trembling. Caleb looked up, startled. "What are you talking about? There's a man looking for you. A man in a suit. He showed me your picture." For a moment, Caleb didn't move. Then his jaw tightened, and his eyes darkened in a way that made Ellen's stomach twist. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," she said quickly. "But he's not going to stop." "Who is he, Caleb? What's going on?" Caleb stood, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the barn. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "You don't want to know. Try me." He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the polar bear. The animal stirred, its massive paws twitching as it dreamed. Caleb sighed, as if the weight of his secrets was finally too much to bear. "I used to work for an organization," he began, his voice low. "Government adjacent. Black Ops, off-the-book stuff. We did things no one ever talks about, things that haunt you in the middle of the night." Ellen's eyes widened, but she said nothing, letting him continue. 2 years ago, we were sent to the Arctic on a mission. Officially, it was environmental research. Unofficially, we were testing experimental tech. Something went wrong. We triggered something. A chain reaction that disrupted the ecosystem. Dozens of animals died. Entire colonies wiped out. And the ones that survived? They were different. Different how? More aggressive. More desperate. This bear shouldn't even be here, Ellen. It's hundreds of miles from its natural range. And his voice cracked. "I'm the reason why." Ellen's breath caught. "So you're trying to make it right?" Caleb shook his head. "There's no making it right. But I couldn't just walk away. Not again." The barn door creaked open, and both of them froze. Jake stepped inside, his face grim. "That man in the suit? He's talking to everyone in town. Won't be long before he finds you." Caleb's expression hardened. "Then I need to leave." Jake nodded toward the polar bear. "And what about that?" "I'll take it with me," Caleb said without hesitation. Ellen gaped at him. "You're not serious?" "I am." Caleb's voice was firm. "If they find the bear, they'll kill it. They'll see it as a threat or an experiment gone wrong. I won't let that happen." Jake crossed his arms. "You realize what you're saying, right? You're talking about going into the wilderness with a half-dead polar bear and God knows who hunting you down." Caleb met his gaze. "It's not the first time I've had to survive against the odds." By nightfall, Caleb was ready. He'd fashioned a makeshift sled to carry the bear, packed with food and medical supplies. Ellen handed him a thermos of coffee, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. "Yes, I do," Caleb replied. He hesitated, then added, "But thank you. For everything." Jake handed him a rifle. "You're gonna need this." Caleb slung it over his shoulder, gave them one last nod, and began walking into the snow. The polar bear's sled creaked behind him, its weight heavy but manageable. As he disappeared into the darkness, Ellen and Jake stood in silence, watching until they could no longer see him. "What do you think he's running from?" Ellen whispered. Jake's jaw tightened. "Something worse than a polar bear." The wilderness swallowed Caleb whole. The crunch of his boots on the snow was the only sound in the vast silence of the Alaskan tundra. Behind him, the sled groaned under the weight of the polar bear, its breaths shallow but steady. The biting wind stung his face, but he pressed on, his eyes scanning the horizon for shelter. Caleb's mind raced as he moved. He knew the man in the suit wouldn't waste time. The organization he once worked for, Project Blackwater, was as relentless as it was powerful. They didn't just hunt people, they erased them along with anyone who got in the way. He glanced back at the bear, its massive body rising and falling with each labored breath. Its survival had become his mission, a purpose he hadn't felt in years. But it wasn't just about the bear. Saving it was his redemption, a chance to undo even a fragment of the damage he'd caused. Back in Coldhaven, the man in the suit wasn't wasting time. He stood in the town's only diner, his presence commanding the room. A tablet in his hand displayed a map of the surrounding area, marked with red dots that indicated potential routes Caleb might take. His truck's still here, the man said to his team, 2 agents dressed in black standing nearby. Which means he's on foot. With the bear, his movement will be slow. He can't have gone far. Jake sat at the counter, pretending to sip his coffee. He listened carefully, his gut twisting with unease. Ellen had been right. This man wasn't just here to find Caleb, he was here to eliminate him. The man in the suit turned to the room, his cold gaze sweeping over the diners. If anyone here is harboring information about Caleb Grayson, I suggest you come forward now. Cooperation will be rewarded. Silence will not. No one spoke. Jake gritted his teeth, his fingers tightening around his coffee mug. He knew Caleb was likely heading north, toward the uninhabited wilderness where no one would think to look. But that wasn't something he planned to share. The man in the suit smirked, sensing the room's defiance. "Very well," he said, sliding his tablet into his coat. "You've made your choice." He turned to his agents. "Sweep the perimeter. Find his tracks. He won't get far." Caleb found shelter just as the storm began to pick up again. A shallow cave, half hidden by a cluster of snow-laden pines, offered enough protection for the night. He carefully unloaded the sled, using his coat to create a makeshift blanket for the bear. As he worked, his thoughts drifted to the last time he'd felt this kind of desperation. 2 years ago, on that fateful mission, he and his team had been sent to test an experimental sonar device designed to map the ocean floor. What they hadn't known was that the device emitted frequencies capable of disrupting marine life and the ice sheets beneath it. The result had been catastrophic. Entire ecosystems collapsed, polar bears and seals left without food or shelter as the ice melted faster than ever. Caleb had argued against the project, but his superiors didn't care. When he threatened to expose them, they turned on him. Now, the same people who had ruined him and the Arctic were hunting him down. Morning brought no relief. The storm had passed, but the air was colder than ever, and the snow glistened under the pale sunlight. Caleb set off again, the bear still too weak to walk. Hours passed in tense silence, each step a reminder of the danger closing in. Caleb's survival instincts, honed from years of fieldwork, told him he was being tracked. He scanned the landscape constantly, looking for signs, footprints, the glint of a scope, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. It wasn't until he reached the edge of a frozen river that he spotted them. 3 figures in the distance, moving fast and closing in. "Damn it," Caleb muttered under his breath. He pulled the rifle from the sled, his heart pounding. He couldn't outrun them, not with the bear. His only option was to create a diversion. He knelt beside the bear, his hand resting gently on its head. "I'm sorry, big guy," he whispered. "I need you to stay here. I'll come back for you." The bear's dark eyes flickered open, and for a moment, Caleb felt a pang of guilt so sharp it almost stopped him. But he had no choice. He grabbed the rifle and ran, leaving the sled behind. He sprinted toward the river, his boots slipping on the ice. As he reached the center, he turned and fired a warning shot into the air. The figures in the distance stopped, then began to fan out, their movements precise and practiced. Caleb's heart raced. He fired again, this time aiming at the snow near one of the figures. They ducked for cover, giving him a moment to think. He knew the river was thinly frozen. If he could lure them onto it, their weight might break the ice. "Come on," he muttered, backing away slowly. The agents took the bait, stepping onto the ice with careful precision. Caleb waited until they were halfway across before firing another shot, this one aimed directly at the ice beneath their feet. A loud crack echoed through the air, followed by a deafening roar as the ice gave way. 2 of the agents plunged into the freezing water, their screams cut short by the shock of the cold. The 3rd agent hesitated, then turned back toward the shore. Caleb took his chance, disappearing into the forest before they could regroup. As night fell, Caleb made his way back to the sled, praying the bear was still there. To his relief, it was, and it wasn't alone. Standing beside the sled was a woman, her face partially hidden by a hood. She held a rifle, her stance defensive but not hostile. "You've got a lot of people looking for you," she said, her voice steady. Caleb froze, his mind racing. Who are you? She lowered the hood, revealing sharp green eyes and a scar that ran from her temple to her jawline. Someone who knows what Blackwater is capable of, she replied. And someone who can help you bring them down? Caleb tightened his grip on the rifle, his eyes fixed on the stranger standing next to the sled. She didn't flinch, even as the tension crackled between them like static in the cold air. If you're here to help, Caleb said slowly, you've got a funny way of showing it. The woman raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. If I wanted you dead, I'd have shot you already. Trust me, I'm not your enemy. Caleb didn't lower his weapon. Then who are you? The woman crouched beside the polar bear, her movements calm and deliberate. She inspected its wound, nodding in approval at Caleb's handiwork. Name's Lena, she said finally. Used to be with Blackwater, same as you? Caleb stiffened. That doesn't exactly inspire trust. Lena stood, meeting his gaze. I walked away, just like you. But unlike you, I didn't wait for them to come after me. I've been tracking them for months, exposing their operations one by one. And now, you've given me the perfect opportunity to hit them where it hurts. I didn't sign up for a crusade, Caleb said, his voice edged with frustration. No, Lena replied, her tone sharp. You signed up to clean up your mess. But whether you like it or not, Blackwater isn't going to stop until they erase you and that bear. So you can keep running, or you can fight back. Caleb hesitated. Her words struck a nerve, the truth of them sinking in like the icy wind cutting through his coat. He glanced at the bear, its massive body rising and falling with each breath. It was a symbol of everything he'd done wrong, and everything he still had to make right. What's your plan? He asked finally. Lena led him deeper into the forest, moving with a confidence that spoke of years of survival training. They found a small, hidden clearing where Caleb set up a temporary shelter for the bear. As they worked, Lena began to piece together Caleb's story. You were part of the sonar project, weren't you? She asked, breaking the silence. Caleb nodded, his jaw tight. I tried to stop it. When I realized what it was doing to the environment, I reported it to the higher-ups. They ignored me. Said the data was more important than a few dead animals. A few? Lena's voice was bitter. Try entire species on the brink of collapse. That project wasn't just reckless, it was a weapon. They were testing its potential for environmental warfare. Caleb froze, the weight of her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. Warfare? Lena nodded. Think about it. If you can destabilize an ecosystem, you can control resources, displace populations, and cripple entire regions without firing a single shot. Blackwater didn't care about the Arctic, they were running a proof of concept. And you were the scapegoat? The realization made Caleb's stomach churn. He'd known the organization was corrupt, but he hadn't understood the full extent of their plans. They sent you to clean up loose ends, Lena continued, her green eyes narrowing. But when you pushed back, you became one. As night fell, they built a small fire to keep warm. The polar bear stirred, its dark eyes flickering open. Caleb moved to its side, offering water from a canteen. Lena watched him, her expression unreadable. You care about that bear, don't you? It's not just a bear, Caleb said quietly. It's a survivor. Just like me. Lena tilted her head, studying him. You're not what I expected. Caleb smirked faintly. What did you expect? Someone like the others. Cold. Calculating. Willing to do whatever it takes to survive, no matter who gets hurt. He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the bear. I used to be that person. Not anymore. Lena softened, her scar catching the firelight. Good. Because if we're going to take down Blackwater, we're going to need someone who remembers what it means to care. The next morning, Lena laid out her plan. There's a research outpost about 50 miles north of here, she said, tracing a map with her finger. Blackwater uses it as a staging ground for their Arctic operations. If we can get inside, we'll find the data we need to expose them. That's a big if, Caleb said, frowning. Lena shrugged. I've been inside before. I know their protocols. The hard part will be getting there without being spotted. Caleb glanced at the bear. And what about him? We'll bring him, Lena said simply. Leaving him behind isn't an option, not with Blackwater hunting us. Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is insane." "Maybe," Lena replied. "But it's the only chance we've got." They set out at dawn, the bear strapped securely to the sled. Lena led the way, her movements quick and precise, while Caleb kept watch for any signs of pursuit. The journey was grueling. The snow was deep, the wind relentless, and every step felt like a battle against the elements. But they pressed on, driven by a shared determination. By the time they reached the outskirts of the outpost, the sun was sinking low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the frozen landscape. Lena crouched behind a ridge, pulling out a pair of binoculars. "There," she said, pointing to a cluster of buildings surrounded by barbed wire. "That's where we need to go." Caleb peered through the binoculars, his heart sinking at the sight of armed guards patrolling the perimeter. "How do you plan to get us in there?" Lena grinned, her scar pulling slightly. "You'd be surprised what you can accomplish with a little distraction." The plot thickens as Caleb and Lena prepare to infiltrate the Blackwater outpost. The biting wind howled as Caleb and Lena lay flat on the ridge, surveying the Blackwater outpost below. The barbed wire fence, floodlights, and armed guards made it clear this was no ordinary research station. This was a fortress, hidden under the guise of science. Lena's voice was a whisper against the cold. "We have two problems. First, the guards are on high alert. Second, those towers aren't just for show. Motion sensors, thermal imaging, you name it, they've got it." Caleb frowned, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "And the solution?" She slid her backpack off and began unpacking its contents. A tangle of wires, a small remote, and what looked like a can of spray paint. "We create chaos. These guards are trained to respond to emergencies. If we give them one, we'll have a window to slip inside." "What kind of emergency?" Lena smirked. "A distraction big enough to make them look the other way." "You up for playing bait?" The plan was simple in theory but dangerously unpredictable in execution. Caleb would create a diversion at the south end of the outpost, drawing the guards away from the main building. Meanwhile, Lena would disable the security systems and gain access to the control room. As they prepared, the polar bear stirred on the sled, its eyes opening sluggishly. Caleb knelt beside it, stroking its fur. "Stay here, big guy. We'll be back soon." The bear blinked slowly, its breathing steady but labored. Caleb felt a pang of guilt leaving it behind, but Lena had been adamant. "We can't risk it being seen," she'd said. "Not yet." Nightfall brought the perfect cover. Caleb moved carefully along the edge of the perimeter, sticking to the shadows. He carried a bundle of flares, their bright light and smoke designed to disorient the guards. When he reached the south end of the fence, he lit the first flare and tossed it into the open. The sudden burst of light illuminated the snow, catching the attention of the nearest guards. "What the hell?" one of them muttered, signaling to his partner. Caleb lit another flare, this time hurling it closer to the fence. The guards shouted, their voices crackling through radios as reinforcements were called. The chaos worked. Caleb watched as more guards converged on his location, their attention fully diverted. He crouched low, slipping into the shadows and circling back toward the main building. Meanwhile, Lena moved with precision. She approached the security station from the north, avoiding the patrols. Using the spray can, she coated the lens of a thermal camera, effectively blinding it. At the fence, she pulled out a pair of wire cutters and snipped through the links, creating a small opening. She slid through and made her way to the building's side entrance. Inside, the corridors were cold and sterile, the hum of fluorescent lights echoing softly. Lena navigated the halls with practiced ease, her movements quick and deliberate. She reached the control room and set to work, plugging a small device into the main terminal. The screen flickered as her device bypassed the security protocols, feeding her access to the outpost's data. She worked quickly, downloading files onto a portable drive. As she scanned the files, her expression darkened. Blackwater's plans were worse than she'd imagined. There were detailed reports on experiments designed to manipulate ecosystems, targeting not just the Arctic but other vulnerable regions worldwide. She also found something else, a dossier on Caleb. It detailed every aspect of his life, his past, his work with Blackwater, and even his current whereabouts. "They're tracking us," Lena muttered, her jaw tightening. She grabbed the drive and pocketed it, knowing there was no time to waste. Outside, Caleb was running out of options. The guards were beginning to realize the flares were a distraction, their attention shifting back to the main outpost. He ducked behind a snowdrift, his breath coming in sharp bursts. He needed to buy Lena more time. Reaching into his pack, he pulled out a small explosive charge, a last resort. He set it near one of the support beams for the outer watchtower and lit the fuse. The explosion ripped through the night, sending a shockwave that knocked Caleb off his feet. The tower collapsed in a shower of sparks and debris, throwing the outpost into chaos. Lena heard the explosion and cursed under her breath. Damn it, Caleb. She knew he was improvising, and that meant things were spiraling out of control. Grabbing the portable drive, she made her way out of the control room, her heart pounding. She reached the fence just as Caleb appeared, his face smudged with soot but otherwise unharmed. "Was that you?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Had to buy you time," Caleb replied, his breathing ragged. Lena didn't argue. They slipped through the fence and disappeared into the forest, the sound of alarms and shouting fading behind them. Back at their makeshift camp, Caleb and Lena regrouped. The polar bear was awake now, its eyes following their movements. "What did you find?" Caleb asked. Lena handed him the drive. "Everything. Their plans, their experiments, their operations, it's all here." Caleb stared at the drive, the weight of it sinking in. This could expose them. Shut them down for good. Lena nodded. "But it won't be easy. They'll come after us with everything they've got." Caleb glanced at the bear, then back at Lena. "Then we'd better be ready." The fire crackled softly as Caleb and Lena huddled close, their breaths forming misty clouds in the freezing air. The polar bear lay a few feet away, its massive body rising and falling rhythmically. The tension in the camp was palpable, the weight of the stolen data pressing heavily on them. Caleb stared at the portable drive in his hands, his mind racing. "This is enough to bring them down, isn't it?" Lena nodded, her expression grim. "If we can get it to the right people. Journalists, whistleblower networks, they'll tear Blackwater apart. But they'll come for us before we can even get close." The polar bear stirred, lifting its head and sniffing the air. Caleb followed its gaze, his instincts kicking in. "Something's wrong." Lena froze, her hand moving to the pistol on her hip. "What is it?" Before Caleb could answer, a low hum filled the air, growing louder by the second. A spotlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the forest. "Drones," Lena hissed. The camp erupted into chaos. Caleb grabbed his rifle, while Lena stuffed the portable drive into her jacket. The polar bear growled, its massive frame shifting as it prepared to defend itself. The drones descended, their cameras and mounted weapons trained on the camp. A voice crackled through a loudspeaker. "Caleb Wyatt and Lena Price, surrender now. Resistance will be met with lethal force." Caleb exchanged a glance with Lena. "They found us faster than I expected." "They always do," Lena replied, her voice tight. "We need to move." No. They scrambled to pack their supplies, but the drones didn't wait. One of them fired a warning shot, the bullet striking a tree inches from Caleb's head. "Go!" Lena shouted, shoving him toward the sled. Caleb secured the bear onto the sled as quickly as he could, the animal growling in protest. He glanced over his shoulder to see Lena firing at the drones, her aim precise. The first drone went down in a shower of sparks, but 3 more took its place. "This way," Lena called, motioning toward the dense forest. Caleb pulled the sled, his muscles straining against the weight and the uneven terrain. The polar bear roared, its primal instinct kicking in as the sound of gunfire filled the air. They ran for what felt like hours, the drones relentless in their pursuit. Lena led them through a narrow ravine, the towering walls providing some cover. "We can't keep this up," Caleb said, his voice strained. Lena didn't respond, her focus on finding their next move. Finally, she spotted a cave entrance partially hidden by snow and ice. "There," she shouted, pointing. Caleb dragged the sled inside, the bear barely fitting through the narrow opening. Lena followed, firing one last shot before ducking inside. "Where are you watching this video from? Comment here, we want to know. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Let's go to history. The cave was cold and dark, the air damp and heavy. Caleb collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving. The polar bear settled beside him, its massive body providing a surprising sense of comfort. We bought ourselves some time, Lena said, her voice low. But they'll find us again. It's only a matter of time. As they caught their breath, Lena pulled out the portable drive and a small laptop. She powered it up, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "What are you doing?" Caleb asked. "Sending the data," she replied. "We can't keep running forever. If this information gets out, Blackwater won't have the resources to keep chasing us." Caleb nodded, though doubt lingered in his mind. "And what if they track the signal?" "They will," Lena said simply. "But by the time they do, it'll be too late." The tension in the cave was almost unbearable as Lena worked. Caleb kept watch at the entrance, his rifle at the ready. The polar bear rested beside him, its breathing steady but its eyes alert. Minutes felt like hours as Lena uploaded the files, each passing second a reminder of how close they were to being found. Finally, she let out a small sigh of relief. "It's done." Caleb turned to her. "That's it?" She nodded. "The files are in the hands of a dozen journalists and activist groups. Even if Blackwater shuts down one, the others will spread it. This is the beginning of the end for them." Their relief was short-lived. A sudden explosion rocked the cave, sending a shower of snow and ice cascading from the entrance. "They've found us," Lena said, her voice grim. Caleb raised his rifle, his heart pounding. The polar bear growled, its massive frame shifting as it prepared to fight. The first figure appeared at the entrance, a soldier clad in Blackwater's signature gear. Caleb fired, his shot finding its mark. But more followed. "Fall back," Lena shouted, grabbing the bear's harness. They retreated deeper into the cave, the sound of gunfire echoing around them. Caleb and Lena fought side by side, their movements perfectly in sync. The polar bear charged forward, its roar reverberating through the cave. It swiped at one of the soldiers, sending him flying into the wall. But for every enemy they took down, more seemed to appear. As they reached the far end of the cave, Caleb spotted a narrow tunnel. "Through here," he shouted. Lena hesitated, glancing at the bear. "It won't fit." Caleb's jaw tightened. "We're not leaving it behind." Lena nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we make our stand here." The gunfire echoed through the narrow tunnel as Caleb and Lena pressed themselves against the rocky walls. The polar bear growled low, its massive body blocking the path behind them. The soldiers advanced, their footsteps crunching on the icy floor. Lena reloaded her pistol, her hands trembling slightly. "We're out of options, Caleb." He glanced back at the bear, its dark eyes locked on him as if waiting for his command. He felt an unspoken connection, a trust forged through shared survival. "We'll find a way," Caleb said, gripping his rifle tightly. But as the soldiers neared, something unexpected happened. A voice rang out, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Hold your fire." The soldiers froze, their weapons trained on the group but their fingers hesitating on the triggers. From the ranks, a figure emerged, a woman in her early 50s, her dark coat pristine despite the harsh environment. Her sharp features and piercing eyes gave her an air of authority that demanded attention. Lena's face darkened as recognition dawned. "Dr. Evelyn Chase," she spat, her voice filled with venom. Caleb looked at her, confused. "Who?" "She's the head of Blackwater's Arctic Division," Lena said. "The mastermind behind everything." Dr. Chase stepped forward, her hands raised in a mock gesture of peace. "Lena, Caleb, I must say, I'm impressed. You've been quite the thorn in our side." "Stay back," Caleb warned, raising his rifle. Dr. Chase ignored him, her gaze fixed on Lena. "You always were the clever one. But you should have known better than to cross me." The tension in the air was suffocating. Caleb glanced between Lena and Dr. Chase, trying to piece together the unspoken history between them. "What is she talking about?" he asked, his voice low. Lena hesitated, her jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter. She's here to finish what she started." Dr. Chase smirked. "Oh, but it does matter. Tell him, Lena. Tell him how you used to work for me." Caleb's eyes widened. "What?" Lena's silence spoke volumes. It's true, Dr. Chase continued, her tone dripping with satisfaction. Lena was one of my top researchers. Brilliant, resourceful, until she decided to betray us. That's not what happened, Lena snapped, her voice shaking with anger. I didn't betray you, I exposed you. The world deserves to know the truth about what you're doing here. And what did that accomplish? Dr. Chase asked, her expression cold. You've endangered lives, human and animal alike. And for what? Some misguided sense of justice? Caleb felt a knot form in his stomach. He had trusted Lena, believed in her mission, but now he wasn't sure what to think. Is it true? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Did you work for them? Lena met his gaze, her eyes filled with guilt. I did, but not like she's saying. I joined Blackwater to protect wildlife, to make a difference. But when I realized what they were really doing, I couldn't stay silent. Dr. Chase's smirk deepened. And yet, here you are, dragging him and that bear into your mess. Caleb's grip on his rifle tightened. He didn't know who to believe, but he knew one thing. They needed to get out of this alive. Dr. Chase took a step closer, her eyes flicking to the bear. Impressive specimen. You do realize it's the key to our research, don't you? Caleb frowned. What are you talking about? The bear, Dr. Chase said, her tone matter of fact. Its biology is unique, adapted to survive in the harshest conditions. We've been studying its kind for years, hoping to unlock the secrets of resilience and adaptation. But this one, she paused, her gaze lingering on the bear. This one is special. The bear growled, sensing the tension in the air. You're not taking it, Caleb said firmly. Dr. Chase arched an eyebrow. And how do you plan to stop me? You're outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered. Lena stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. You'll have to kill us first? Dr. Chase smiled coldly. That can be arranged. Before anyone could react, the bear roared and lunged forward, its massive paw swiping at the nearest soldier. Chaos erupted as the soldiers opened fire, the sound deafening in the confined space. Caleb and Lena took advantage of the distraction, firing at the soldiers as they scrambled to take cover. The bear fought fiercely, its strength and speed defying belief. Amid the chaos, Dr. Chase retreated, shouting orders into a radio. Fall back. Contain them at all costs. The battle was brutal and short-lived. Caleb and Lena managed to fend off the soldiers, but the cost was high. The bear was wounded, a bullet grazing its side. We need to move, Lena said, her voice urgent. Caleb nodded, his heart heavy as he looked at the injured bear. Can it keep going? It has to, Lena replied. If they capture it, everything we've done will be for nothing. As they made their escape, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Dr. Chase had retreated too easily, and the soldiers had been too quick to withdraw. They're setting a trap, he said, his voice grim. Lena nodded, her expression hard. Then we'll have to spring it on our terms? The icy wind bit at their faces as Caleb, Lena, and the wounded polar bear trudged through the unforgiving Arctic terrain. The storm had picked up, covering their tracks and offering temporary respite from pursuit. But Caleb's mind was spinning with questions, doubts, and the growing realization that they were being hunted. We can't keep this up, he said, breaking the tense silence. The bear is injured, we're low on supplies, and Blackwater is probably right behind us. Lena glanced at him, her face pale but resolute. There's a research station about 15 miles from here. It's abandoned, but we can use it to regroup. Maybe even set a trap for them. A trap? Caleb asked, raising an eyebrow. Against an entire private army? You're starting to sound as reckless as me. Lena smirked faintly, though her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. Desperate times, Wyatt. The polar bear trudged behind them, its head low but its spirit unbroken. Caleb couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. They had dragged this creature into their fight, and now it was paying the price. As they approached the abandoned station, the storm began to ease, revealing a decrepit building half buried in snow. The windows were shattered, and the roof sagged under the weight of accumulated ice, but it would do. Inside, Lena quickly set to work rigging the area with whatever she could find: wires, old fuel canisters, and a few grenades she'd salvaged from the Blackwater soldiers. Caleb helped where he could, his thoughts heavy with doubt. "Do you really think this will stop them?" he asked, watching as Lena connected a tripwire to a makeshift explosive. "It's not about stopping them," she said, her tone clipped. "It's about buying time." "For what?" Lena paused, her gaze meeting his. "For the truth to spread. The files I sent, they're out there now. Journalists are digging, activists are mobilizing. Blackwater's days are numbered, but they'll burn everything down trying to silence us." Caleb nodded, though the weight of her words didn't ease the tightness in his chest. That night, as the wind howled outside, Caleb sat beside the polar bear, gently cleaning the wound on its side. The animal let out a low rumble, its dark eyes watching him with an intelligence that was almost unsettling. "You're tougher than I'll ever be," Caleb muttered, his voice soft. "I don't know how you keep going." The bear huffed, its breath warm against his hand. Caleb felt a strange sense of calm in its presence, as if it understood the unspoken fears that clawed at him. The next morning, the sound of engines shattered the stillness. Caleb and Lena exchanged a look, their unspoken understanding clear. It was time. Blackwater's forces arrived in full force, armored vehicles, drones, and soldiers fanning out in a coordinated assault. Dr. Evelyn Chase stood at the forefront, her cold gaze fixed on the station. "Lena," she called, her voice amplified through a loudspeaker. "You've made your point, but this ends now. Surrender the bear, and I might let you live." Lena leaned out of a broken window, her pistol trained on Chase. "Go to hell." Chase sighed, her patience clearly wearing thin. She motioned to the soldiers, and the assault began. The first explosion ripped through the front of the station, sending debris and snow flying. Caleb and Lena fought back with everything they had, using the traps and explosives to slow the advancing forces. The polar bear roared, its primal fury unleashed as it charged at the soldiers, scattering them like leaves in the wind. Caleb marveled at its strength and resilience, even as bullets tore through the air around it. But Blackwater's numbers were overwhelming. For every soldier they took down, more appeared, closing in like a relentless tide. Then the unthinkable happened. In the chaos, Caleb spotted Lena standing at the edge of the battlefield, holding a small device, a detonator. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and regret. "What are you doing?" Caleb shouted, his voice hoarse. "This is the only way," she replied, her voice barely audible over the din. Caleb's blood ran cold as he realized what she meant. The entire station was rigged to blow, and Lena was ready to sacrifice herself to take down Blackwater. "No," he yelled, running toward her. But before he could reach her, a single gunshot rang out. Lena staggered, blood blooming across her chest as she fell to her knees. Dr. Chase stood a few feet away, a smoking pistol in her hand. "You always were too sentimental," Chase said, her tone devoid of emotion. Caleb caught Lena before she hit the ground, his heart pounding. "Lena, no. Stay with me." She coughed, blood staining her lips. "Caleb, you have to finish this." Her trembling hand pressed the detonator into his. "Promise me." Caleb's vision blurred with tears, but he nodded. "I promise." The polar bear let out a deafening roar, charging at Chase with all its remaining strength. The soldiers opened fire, but the bear didn't falter, its massive frame barreling into the enemy lines. Caleb clenched the detonator, his mind racing. He looked at Lena one last time, her eyes closing as the life faded from her. "I'm sorry," he whispered. With a deep breath, he pressed the button. The explosion was blinding, a massive fireball engulfing the station and the surrounding area. Caleb felt the shockwave slam into him, throwing him into the snow. When the dust settled, silence reigned. Blackwater's forces were decimated, their vehicles and drones reduced to smoldering wreckage. Caleb staggered to his feet, his body battered but alive. The polar bear limped toward him, its white fur streaked with blood and soot. Together, they stood in the ruins, the weight of their loss heavy on their shoulders. The Arctic sky was an endless expanse of gray, a cold, indifferent witness to the destruction that had unfolded. Caleb leaned against the remnants of a steel beam, his breath visible in the frigid air. The polar bear lay nearby, its chest heaving as it rested, wounded but alive. For a moment, the silence was almost unbearable. Caleb looked around at the scorched earth, the twisted metal, and the scattered remains of Blackwater's once formidable force. He should have felt victorious, but all he felt was hollow. She gave everything for this, he whispered to himself, clutching the detonator that Lena had handed him in her final moments. The weight of her sacrifice pressed heavily on him, but there was no time to grieve. The world needed to know what had happened here, and Caleb wasn't going to let Lena's story end in vain. As the hours passed, Caleb scavenged what he could from the wreckage. He found a satellite phone, miraculously intact, and used it to send out a signal. It was a simple message, encoded in a way Lena had taught him: Operation Polaris complete. Evidence intact. Assistance required. He didn't know who would respond or when, but he had to trust that someone would come. The bear stirred, its dark eyes locking onto Caleb. Despite its injuries, there was a strength in its gaze that gave him hope. "You're tougher than anyone I've ever met," Caleb said, crouching beside the animal. He gently patted its head, feeling a strange sense of kinship. "We'll get through this. Together." By nightfall, the Arctic wilderness was eerily quiet. Caleb started a small fire using the remnants of a supply crate, the flickering flames offering a semblance of warmth. He thought about Lena, her determination, her courage, and the secrets she had taken to her grave. He remembered the conversations they'd had in quieter moments, when she'd shared her vision for a world where creatures like the polar bear could thrive without human interference. It was a dream that now felt impossibly far away, but Caleb knew he had to carry it forward. The next morning, the distant hum of an approaching helicopter shattered the silence. Caleb's heart raced as he grabbed his rifle, unsure if this was friend or foe. The polar bear stood beside him, growling softly, its body tense and ready to fight. As the helicopter descended, Caleb recognized the emblem on its side, an environmental organization that Lena had worked with in the past. Relief washed over him as the aircraft landed, and a team of medics and activists emerged, their faces filled with a mix of urgency and awe. "Caleb Wyatt," one of them called out, a woman in her early 30s with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. "That's me," Caleb replied, lowering his rifle. The woman approached, her eyes scanning the scene. "We got your signal. The files Lena sent are already making waves. Journalists are publishing exposés, and governments are launching investigations into Blackwater." Caleb nodded, his throat tight. "She didn't make it?" The woman's expression softened. "I'm sorry. She was a hero." "She was more than that," Caleb said, glancing at the polar bear. "She was a force of nature." As the team began tending to the wounded bear, Caleb sat down with the woman, whose name was Mia. She explained how Lena's files had revealed the extent of Blackwater's atrocities, illegal experiments, environmental destruction, and the exploitation of Arctic wildlife. "People are angry," Mia said. "There's already talk of shutting Blackwater down for good. But it's going to take time." Caleb frowned. "Time isn't something we have a lot of. They'll regroup, find new ways to cover their tracks." "Not if we keep the pressure on," Mia replied. "And not if we have people like you to help lead the charge." Caleb wasn't sure he wanted to lead anything. He felt like a man who had stumbled into a war he hadn't signed up for. But as he looked at the polar bear, now being carefully loaded onto a transport sled, he knew he couldn't walk away. "This isn't over," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "No," Mia agreed. "But it's a start." That night, as they flew back to a safe location, Caleb stared out the window at the vast, frozen landscape below. He thought about Lena and the dream she had fought for. He thought about the polar bear and the countless other creatures that depended on people like them to protect what couldn't protect itself. He felt a sense of purpose begin to take root, tempered by grief but driven by hope. The sun broke through the horizon, casting its pale glow over the endless Arctic expanse. Caleb stood at the edge of the outpost, watching the polar bear lumber slowly across the icy plain. It had recovered remarkably well under the care of the rescue team, its wounds healing faster than anyone had expected. The bear paused and turned its head, locking eyes with Caleb one last time. He raised his hand in a silent farewell, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. Then, with a low growl, the bear turned and disappeared into the white wilderness, free at last. "Do you think it'll make it?" Mia asked, stepping up beside him. Caleb nodded, his gaze never leaving the spot where the bear had vanished. "It's tougher than all of us combined. If anyone can survive out here, it's that bear." In the weeks that followed the explosion, the world changed. The files Lena had sent out became the catalyst for a global reckoning. Media outlets across the world ran stories exposing Blackwater's illegal operations, and public outcry grew louder with each passing day. Governments were forced to act. Investigations were launched, arrests were made, and Blackwater's empire began to crumble. Dr. Evelyn Chase, however, remained a fugitive, her whereabouts unknown. "She'll resurface," Mia said one evening as she and Caleb reviewed reports in a small base camp. "People like her always do." "And when she does," Caleb replied, his voice steady, "we'll be ready." Caleb found himself unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight. The world wanted to hear his story, about the polar bear, about Lena, and about the fight to save the Arctic. At first, he was reluctant, uncomfortable with the attention. But Mia reminded him of something Lena had said, "If you don't speak up, who will?" So he spoke. He shared Lena's vision, her sacrifice, and the urgent need to protect the fragile balance of nature. His words resonated, sparking a movement that grew beyond anything he could have imagined. Months later, Caleb returned to the Arctic, this time as part of an international task force dedicated to preserving the region's ecosystem. The outpost that had once been a battlefield was now a sanctuary, a symbol of hope and resilience. He often thought about Lena and the polar bear, their lives forever intertwined with his own. The weight of their loss never left him, but it also fueled his determination to honor their legacy. One evening, as he stood outside the sanctuary's main facility, he spotted a distant figure moving across the ice. His heart leapt as he realized it was the polar bear, healthy and strong, with two smaller cubs trailing behind it. Caleb smiled, a rare but genuine expression of joy. The bear had survived, thrived even, and now it was passing on its strength to the next generation. "Lena," he murmured, his voice carried away by the wind. "We did it." As the Arctic winds howled around him, Caleb knew the fight was far from over. The world was changing, but there was still so much work to be done. Yet, for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. The legacy of Operation Polaris was alive, not just in the files, the headlines, or the policies, but in the lives it had touched and the hope it had sparked. And as Caleb turned to rejoin his team, the polar bear and its cubs disappeared into the vast, untamed wilderness, a living testament to the power of resilience, courage, and the enduring spirit of survival. The end. If you've made it this far, comment, like, share. This will help us a lot. Subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.